Welcome to the Harmony Channel. Thank you for joining me. I really want to thank Jack Posobiec for joining me. Jack, one of the great influencers over social media, one of the great voices for the conservative and America First movement, and Jack, someone with an excellent take on the movie Sinners. You guys have seen me talk about it on this show with Shamika. You've seen me talk about it with Anthony, Virgil, and Kevin. But Jack started tweeting about it yesterday, I believe, and I started responding. And Jack is a strong Catholic. He's a strong, again, bold person that's willing to stand up to the kind of bigotry that's being directed at white Americans. And, you know, anything that I've seen in pop culture over the past couple of years, this movie I found to be the most offensive, the most blatantly and nakedly anti-white movie that I think I've ever seen. And I'm looking at young people eat it up, particularly young Black Americans, and I'm looking at box office sales that are really strong that will be enticing to movie makers like, oh, maybe I can make a movie like Sinners and make money off of it because there seems to be a strong appetite for it. Jack pointed out over social media yesterday, and let's pull Jack up, that this is just a remake, a spoof of Dusk Till Dawn, a George Clooney movie that I haven't seen, but I did read up on it, and I am going to watch it this week. But Jack, I want to give you a second here just to unpack your thoughts and how this movie hit, and I'm sure you've seen the movie, but how this movie struck you.
No, I have, Jason. Thanks so much for having me on. And, you know, this was a film where, look, I like horror movies. I'm a fan of the genre. And, you know, different movies are coming out. And some friends of mine, we always sort of chat about, hey, what's the, you know, latest and greatest film that's out? And a lot of people are saying Sinners. Go see Sinners. This is the next best thing. This is the hot thing. Of course, I track box office because I think box office is important in America. When you look at something like Snow White, you know, absolutely tanking, you say, okay, is wokeness done? You know, maybe that version of wokeness is, and we don't like people messing around with Snow White. And then a movie like King of Kings comes out and is breaking records for an animated biblical film that shows there really is a strong audience for that from the great guys over at Angel Guild. And everyone's got to go and support what Angel is doing and join the Angel Guild, because I think that's just, I think it's phenomenal what they're doing. And then a movie like Sinners comes out and the next week, so I was already tracking the box offices, and they said Sinners is going #1, it's going to the top. And I said, well, what is this? And I start watching it. I said, wait a minute, this is, first of all, the very first thing that struck me was, I said, this is the exact same plot as Dusk Till Dawn. It is a Xerox of the Dusk Till Dawn, like, plot points from Quentin Tarantino. It was the first movie that he wrote after, or at least it came out after Pulp Fiction, you know, right in the heyday of Tarantino. And Tarantino actually acts in as one of the main characters in Dusk Till Dawn. It's two brothers, the same way this is two brothers. One's, you know, sort of more cunning, the other one's more impulsive. One turns into a vampire, one doesn't. Tarantino actually turns into the vampire in his, although it's him and George Clooney, and whereas this one it's Michael B. Jordan twice. And what it came down to it, though, was I said, wait a minute, this is just anti-white hatred. It is anti-white hatred. This is like Dusk Till Dawn for the Black Lives Matter radicals. And it's cultural looting. It is cultural looting of what they did, taking that story from Quentin Tarantino and that great film, which is just a fun, campy, you know, B-movie horror. That was set in Mexico. This is set in the Deep South. They both got musical overtones. Cinematography was good, right? I'm willing to give them credit for that. The cinematography was really good. And the music was, you know, was certainly fine. All the guitar solos, I like that. I like Robert Johnson, actually, by the way. My brother's a huge Robert Johnson fan. But when you watch the movie, right, it's still just another one of those films, just like the same vein as Jordan Peele and those horror movies that he's been putting out, to say that all white people are secretly trying to oppress the black people, and the black people should rise up and oppose them, and in this film, you know, get the revenge by, you know, trying to kill them. And I get it, right? It's very ham-fisted too, because you read these reviews and they say, oh, it's so sophisticated, it's so sophisticated. It's not sophisticated. I get it. You have the juke, So they got the juke spot, and that's where that represents sort of, black, Reconstruction era. Everything's going well, but then you have the white infiltrators, and that represents assimilation. And then, blues is sort of like the music of the. I get it. It's not really that complicated to figure out what you're doing here. And instead of having this plot where it's okay, we're all going to unite to fight the vampires. It's very clear. It's black people versus white people. And what's really interesting about this, because I was talking about it with a friend the other day, and I said, wait a minute, come to think of it, the movie Blade, you ever see that series Blade with Wesley Snipes back in the 90s?
Wesley Snipes, yeah.
Yeah, and so that was a movie, right, where, it occurred to me, I said, you know what, that was a black vampire, but sort of an anti-vampire, right? So, and he was the hero, and the vampires were pretty much all white in the series. Now, they weren't all white, because his mother was a vampire as well, but I said, wait a minute, but it wasn't racial. Right? It was just a human, or, in his case, a half human versus vampires. It was just a supernatural horror movie, and nobody had a problem with it because there was no racial narrative whatsoever. So once again, that's a movie where you've got vampires, and you did actually have, I never thought of it this way, a racial sense to it, because it's not written that way. It's not written from a racial sense at all. There's no KKK members and all this stuff about the Deep South. It's just a fun movie that nobody ever had a problem with. But for some reason, Marvel never wants to talk about that, because they came out and they said, oh, well, actually, the first Marvel movie starring a black superhero was Black Panther. I said, wait a minute. Blade was a Marvel superhero, and everybody liked Blade. And to kind of tie it all together, who was the director of Black Panther? Well, the same director as Sinners. It was Ryan Coogler, the exact same guy. So it's very clear. This is a political, racial agenda that they put on top of the film, which, by the way, probably could have been a good movie. It looks good. You got great actors. Michael B. Jordan, he's a fantastic actor ever since The Wire. So, you've got all of the elements. It's just that they've got to have to throw this woke, racialized programming on top of everything.
And so they did do a few clever things to justify their racial narrative. And the number one thing they did was set it in 1932 Mississippi. Right. That's intentional. And so they believe, like, hey, 1932 Mississippi, of course, the only way to make the movie is to cover the racial dynamic, because 1932 Mississippi, everywhere you went, it was just suffocating with racism, and you can't tell a story about 1932 Mississippi without that element. But as you and I know, as moviegoers and people that like to think about movies, that's a choice. This movie could be told in 1982, 2002, 2022. They chose 1932, and they could have chosen Chicago. They could have chosen any city. They chose Mississippi in 1932 on purpose to justify the racial narrative they wanted to promote.
Yeah, exactly. That was just, so in script writing or storytelling, that has nothing to do with the actual plot. That is just the window dressing on top of it. That's the aesthetics. You can change out and that's basically what I'm talking about when I say they Xeroxed it from, they culturally eluded it from Dusk Till Dawn. Dusk Till Dawn is set in Mexico because they have to sneak across the border, and then they end up in this, I think it's actually a strip joint, where they get holed up, and then they're trying to survive the vampire siege from Dusk Till Dawn. But it's the same story. So you could set this story anywhere, but these were all, as you say, deliberate choices that Hollywood has put money behind, that these individuals in Hollywood and the people who are making this film have decided that they want to put out there to achieve a certain effect, because they're playing to a market, or perhaps, creating that market to say, this is the story that we want to tell. Again, going back to Blade, that was a very successful movie. It was a successful franchise. I do think that the TV show Blade didn't do as well because they couldn't get Wesley Snipes back. They could have. He had some tax issues, but he was actually found, or he got most of it knocked away, taken care of. And I just think they didn't have that star power with the TV show Blade. But again, it's a very similar story, but what was the difference? You didn't have this massive racialized element where we're going to say, oh, this is all about pitting people against each other. And even in the movie, right, they bring in, so it's the Irish vampires, and they say, well, you know, we're offering you power, and this is the way that you can fight back against the systemic oppression and cultural legacy, and we're going to fight back too. And again, these are Marxist narratives. They are Marxist narratives that every country and every place at every time is an oppressor class and oppressed class, and that the goal of the government or the goal of the revolutionary is to overthrow the status quo and then liberate the people who are being oppressed. And therefore, by the way, this is the same reason that when you have crime that occurs, well, if it's a member of that certain class, which is the protected class, they'll say, oh, well, that person was lashing out because of the oppression that they were feeling on the behest of the oppressor. So if it's a member of the oppressor class, they're not actually the victim of the crime. And this is where you get into the Marxist version of something that even psychologists talk about in narcissism, where they'll say it's called DARVO, so DARVO, where it's deny, attack, and then reverse victim and offender. So deny what happened, attack the person who's upset, and then you reverse the victim and offender in a situation. Now, anyone who's been in a bad relationship with one of these types, and they come in guys and girls, we all know that situation. You say, wait a minute, you're the one who did something, but I'm the one who's in trouble for it because you're mad that I said something. No, that's not what happened. This is what they do on a societal level, and it is emotional manipulation, it is programming, and in this case, rather than being done in the sort of the classic Marxist sense, which was economic class warfare, what you're seeing here is divide the country up into racial groups, to divide the country up into gender groups, and there you go. You still get your same Marxist agitation, only now it's being done through Hollywood.
Listening to your definition of Darvos, I think you called it.
Darvo, yeah.
My mind immediately went to Austin Metcalf, Carmelo Anthony. They've reversed who the victim is. Carmelo Anthony's the guy that stabbed someone, and they're arguing he's the victim. And we're watching this type of thing play out in real time. A 17-year-old stabs another 17-year-old, and somehow the killer and his family, they're the real victims. Their life's in jeopardy. Go send them a bunch of money. Carmelo's being denied justice. It's this type of psychosis that they're promoting has real impact. We can't reach a consensus on a 17-year-old stabbing another unarmed 17-year-old in the heart because of all of this programming that we've been done, and only a certain skin color can be a victim. We've muddied up an obvious murder with what you're talking about.
Well, that's exactly right. And what Dominique Alexandre had done at that press conference that he held, which, by the way, it blew my mind when I heard that he was holding a press conference. Because typically when, you're representing someone, I understand he's not the lawyer, he's an advocate, but even still, when you're representing someone, your words carry weight. So typically you would hear a press conference from the victim's family would come forward. Ben Crump has an entire career doing this. But in this case, we have something where it's the perpetrator has now flipped everything backwards. By the way, this is why I think that they threw Jeff Metcalf out of that, who was the father of Austin Metcalf, that they threw him out of there, because the Darvo technique doesn't work if you have an actual victim present in your midst. And Jeff Metcalf, by the way, he sat back there completely politely. He has obviously said many things that are saying he wants to find unity and forgiveness and all this stuff for Carmelo Anthony, but that didn't matter, because what mattered was the victim status. And I don't think that Jeff Metcalf understands that what they're doing is they need to flip around who the victim was and who was the perpetrator. So in this mind, you get these people that it's a version of neo-Marxism where they come in, they have to flip around who the victim and who the offender is. And to be able to do so, it requires that you can't have an advocate there who's the actual father of the actual victim. They'll say, well, because, in that situation, he's perpetuating this narrative, which, by the way, and I've actually heard what you've said about it as well. We don't actually know what Carmelo Anthony was thinking, but the narrative that they're presenting is that, well, Austin Metcalf is a representative representative of whiteness. And if he's a representative of whiteness, then all of the sins of whiteness, all of the, the slavery, systemic oppression, cultural assimilation, or cultural hegemony, and all of these things are part of Austin Metcalf's fault. And by the way, this is, as you always say, this is the idea of collective justice and collective guilt, which is not biblical. It is not Christian. This is a very primitive version of thinking. This is the way the world was. It was tribal, right? Before Christ came along, it was this idea that, well, this guy who's a member of your tribe did something to my tribe. It was all over the world. And so we've got to go to war over that, where Christ came in and said, no, it is your individual heart, and it is your individual decisions and your individual thoughts in connection with God that you are accountable for. You are accountable for your sins, for your actions, and what you're responsible for. Not your dad, not your mom, not everybody else, not your brother, not your friend, you. And so this is a way that Christ has taught us. This is the way that is the biblical narrative going forward, and is the Christian narrative. It's a very tough narrative, by the way. It's something that's very hard, I think, for a lot of people to accept, because we as humans have fallen nature, and with man's fallen nature, you want to lash out. You want, of course, obviously in a situation like this, you're going to be upset, but at the same time, we're called to a higher standard, and that's the entire point.
Jack, I don't want to keep you forever. I want to squeeze in 2 more questions, then I'm going to let you go. I wasn't expecting to talk about Jeff Metcalf and the Carmelo, but I have to ask a follow-up. I need to know where you stand on this, because you gave me a little indication. I think what Jeff Metcalf has done has been absolutely brilliant. I think it's been biblical. I think it's what MLK and the civil rights movement were able to do by him choosing the Christian path that I know is very hard, of forgiveness, and just him in this moment, like, I'm going to lean into forgiveness, and he's trying to deny himself his need for vengeance and choose Christ's path. I think it's brilliant because it exposes the demonic nature of the other side. He has put Christ first and tried to be very conciliatory and seek peace, while the other side, it exposes the other side, the people defending Carmelo Anthony, the people racializing this, it exposes their demonic nature. They've clearly bought into something outside the body of Christ, and that's what the civil rights, they'd show up at lunch counters, they'd get assaulted by water hoses and dogs, and they'd be dressed up in suits. And it's like, man, look at those people. The people going after them, they look depraved. That's what I feel like Jeff Metcalf has done to the other side of the Carmelo Anthony, Austin Metcalf debate.
That very well may be what Jeff Metcalf is trying to do, but unfortunately, I'm just not seeing any atonement. I'm not, and that's another key piece of it too, right? Christ comes in and says, your sins are forgiven, but go and sin no more. Right? Go and sin no more. And I just haven't seen that atonement yet from either the family or from these advocates who are going out there and, again, just fanning the flame. They kicked Jeff Metcalf out, right? So if he wanted to show, which, by the way, I do think, to your point, absolutely exposed Dominique Alexandre and those just absolute clowns for the demons that they are, because to throw out someone who's a grieving father makes you look horrible, and quite frankly, it really doesn't give anyone much interest in hearing what the rest of what you have to say is, because I do think that Jeff Metcalf was attempting to show up for, say, hey, we can meet together, we can have a prayer. I'm a dad, you're a mom. Let's at least, say this is a terrible situation for all parties involved and try to get past that. But at the same time, they hired this guy. They hired this advocate. They're paying him, presumably either from this fund or some other way that they're paying him. And so, I'm sure he's not doing it for free. And so they've decided to go down this other route. And I think that's a problem, because just like we were talking about in the movie Sinners, what does that do? That divides people. That puts people apart, and that turns this into a no, sure, I guess it's good for donations, right? The same way that in Sinners, I guess it's good for the box office. But what it's bad for? It's bad for the country. And unfortunately, it's going to create more Austin Metcalfs.
Final question, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for the time. I know you probably haven't seen as many black movies as I have. I've seen a lot because I'm interested in what Hollywood is targeting at young black people, and it's just my sensibilities. I found this movie, Sinners, to be the most nakedly racist movie that I've ever seen. That's my takeaway, and it's akin to Birth of a Nation. And we've listened to black people and black historians talk about the evilness of Birth of a Nation and what it did and blah, 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 and I don't disagree with them. It was programming and propaganda. I just don't understand how we can't see this movie, Sinners, and other movies that are not quite as nakedly racist, but they all flirt with this. Why? And I don't know the example in the last 30, 40 years, 50 years. Where's the example of the anti-black movie that is this nakedly racist towards black people? I can't think of the example. It's only promoted and only approved if it's headed one direction. Have I missed something? Have you seen maybe other, the movie that they did with Ada DuVernay and the Central Park Five on Netflix, it's pretty nakedly racist because it's telling a lie about the Central Park Five if you've actually watched them confess to their crimes with their parents sitting there. But this is the most nakedly racist. This movie, Sinners, says white people are the devils. It's as if Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam wrote this movie in 1930.
Yeah, no, I don't think that movie exists, and if there is, I do watch a lot of movies, and like you, even if I don't watch a movie, I still kind of try to keep, like I said, keep an eye on what's coming out the box office, what's getting approved, because that's a good way. It's, people look at opinion polls and they say, oh, this is a great way to understand where the country is. Well, I think looking at the box office is a great way to understand where the country is. Even by the same token that when Twilight was getting big, when 50 Shades of Grey was getting big, it's like, what's going on with women that they're super into this, or there's that Frida McFadden novel series where it's I think it's called The Housemaid, and by the way, the spoiler alert, what does she do at the end of every book? Is she kills the dad and it's this anti-male female revenge fantasy, and these revenge fantasy type genres are out everywhere. They're some of the biggest things in America, and that's why I was so glad that you were talking about this, Jason, because I don't hear anyone else talking about it, but then you go to the stores, you go to airports, you go to the movie theater, they're literally everywhere. And I'm a firm believer in what we put in front of our faces. The media that we consume are absolutely things that then reflect in our behavior, they reflect in our society, they reflect in our culture. And this is something that Andrew Breitbart said. He said that politics is downstream of culture. So what kind of a commentator could I be if I don't understand, or at least try to understand, where the culture is going? And you mentioned how it's possibly the most racist, but there's even more subtle and insidious forms of this all over the place. I caught the SPLC went after me years ago because in 2015 I pointed out that remember when they made Star Wars, when they brought back the Star Wars series and they started doing the Disney ones, and I pointed out that, well, in this film, all of the white males are in the empire, and every single other person who's a quote unquote good guy is either Hispanic or black or female. And so all of the bad guys are white males, right? The same way you see this in commercials, the same way you see this where, white males are the butt of every joke, in sitcoms, et cetera. And now you see it in Star Wars. And in just this last, I guess there's a new Star Wars series out, which is actually a prequel series on Disney Plus, which again is a streaming service for children, where they include a rape scene where there's an imperial officer who, guess what? He's, of course, a white male. And what's he doing? He is rounding up illegal aliens, and who all happen to be played by Hispanic or Latino actors. And there's one who's female that he sexually assaults. And as he's sexually assaulting her, he says something along the lines of, this is an exact quote from, again, Star Wars, Disney Plus, heavily promoted. He says, "We know you're illegal. We've been counting visas." And then he proceeds to, he goes after her, he sexually assaults her, and then she kills him. Again, this stuff is being given to children. This stuff, it's Star Wars, something that we didn't used to have to think was was a part of the cultural warfare battlefield. But guess what? It absolutely is. And I think these people know exactly what they're doing.
Jack, thank you so much for taking the time. I just want to encourage you to remain bold. Obviously, don't listen to the critics. This type of bigotry needed to be spoken out against in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, and it needs to be spoken out against today in 2025. Thank you for being bold and fearless, and thank you guys for watching. Jack and I, we'll see you next time. We'll play some harmony, and we'll see you next time.
Up so divided, stop fighting and stand tall. We used to be a nation, one united. Now we're headed for downfall.